Imagine a courtroom where justice is supposed to be blind, but what happens when prejudice takes over? A racist cop humiliates a black man in front of everyone, shaving his head in an act of power and control. But there's just one problem: he picked the wrong man. Because the person he just attacked? He's not just anyone, he's the judge. And justice is about to hit back harder than ever. The morning air in Minneapolis carried a crisp autumn chill, the kind that hinted at the coming winter but wasn't quite ready to let go of fall. Marcus Bennett adjusted his tie in the rearview mirror before stepping out of his car, the familiar weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders as he approached the courthouse. The grand marble steps stretched before him, their polished surface reflecting the pale sunlight of a day that, by all accounts, should have been like any other. Inside, the courthouse hummed with its usual rhythm, lawyers shuffling through case files, clerks tapping away at keyboards, voices hushed in quiet negotiations. Marcus walked past them with measured steps, nodding politely to a few familiar faces before reaching his chambers. Emma Carter was already there, her desk cluttered with legal briefs and a half-empty coffee cup. The young attorney glanced up, her brown eyes sharp and alert. "Busy morning, Judge Bennett?" she asked, offering a wry smile. "Is there any other kind?" Marcus replied, setting his briefcase down. Emma chuckled before turning serious. "Your docket's full today, but there's one case that stood out: police misconduct. Defendant claims excessive force. Guess who's testifying?" Marcus reached for the file, flipping through the documents with a practiced eye. His fingers stilled when he saw the name. Derek Lawson. Emma nodded. "The same officer from the Jackson case last year. The one you ruled against." Marcus closed the folder, his expression unreadable. "He's testifying?" "He's the arresting officer," Emma said, lowering her voice. "The report looks off. And he's been outside the courtroom all morning." Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he exhaled slowly, then rose to his feet. "Let's get started." As he walked toward the courtroom, a familiar figure came into view. Derek Lawson stood near the entrance, arms crossed, his uniform crisp, his badge polished. His gaze met Marcus's, filled with something that wasn't quite hostility but wasn't far from it either. The moment stretched, heavy and unspoken. Then Lawson leaned slightly toward another officer beside him, murmuring something that Marcus couldn't hear. The other man chuckled, shaking his head. A flicker of unease passed through Marcus, but he ignored it. He had spent years dealing with men like Lawson, officers who believed authority granted them absolute power, who saw people like Marcus as obstacles rather than allies in justice. Just as Marcus reached for the courtroom door, a low voice spoke from behind. "Hear there's gonna be trouble today. Judge Bennett." Marcus turned. A courthouse security officer stood a few feet away, his face unreadable. The feeling of unease sharpened. Marcus studied the man for a beat, then nodded once and pushed open the door. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung shut behind Marcus, muffling the sounds of the courthouse hallway. The room was already filled, attorneys whispering last-minute arguments to their clients, the steady shuffle of papers, the low murmur of observers waiting for the proceedings to begin. He moved forward, his footsteps steady against the polished floor, eyes set on the judge's bench ahead. Before he could take another step, a figure shifted into his path. Derek Lawson stood there, blocking the way, his stance casual but firm. The air between them tensed as Marcus met his gaze. There was something unsettling about Lawson's expression, not anger, not outright hostility, but something worse: amusement. "You really think you're in charge here?" Lawson's voice was low, edged with mockery. "That you get to decide how things work?" Marcus didn't react immediately. He simply held Lawson's gaze, calm and unshaken. Lawson smirked, taking a slow step forward. "See, that's the problem with people like you. You think a robe and a bench give you power. But out there, we're the ones who decide what's what." Marcus remained silent, refusing to be baited. The smirk faded slightly. Lawson's fingers twitched at his side, as if itching to escalate. But when Marcus made to move past him, Lawson's hand shot out, gripping the front of his suit jacket. The pull was sudden, sharp. Marcus stumbled half a step forward, the courtroom's quiet hum stuttering to a halt. Gasps rippled through the spectators. One of the clerks stood frozen near the jury box, a pen hovering mid-air. Lawson's grip tightened, his knuckles brushing against the polished fabric of Marcus's suit. You walk around here like you belong. But let me tell you something. You don't. A single heartbeat passed. Then, with the precision of someone who had done this before, Lawson reached into his pocket, pulled out something small, and flicked it on. A quiet hum filled the room. The unmistakable buzz of electric clippers. The moment stretched thin, disbelief settling over the onlookers. Without hesitation, Lawson dragged the clippers along the side of Marcus's head. A strip of hair fell, dark against the courtroom floor. Another pass, another strip. No one moved, not the attorneys, not the clerks, not the officers stationed by the door. When Lawson finished, he stepped back, admiring his work like an artist assessing a completed canvas. Then he let out a short chuckle. Well, would you look at that? Not so dignified now, are you, Judge? Silence pressed in, thick and suffocating. Marcus lifted a hand, brushing fingertips over the uneven remains of his hair. He let the moment settle. Let Lawson bask in his own audacity. Then, in a voice as steady as ever, he spoke. Are you done? The smirk on Lawson's face twitched. Without waiting for an answer, Marcus straightened his suit, adjusted his sleeves, and walked past him. The courtroom, still stunned into stillness, parted for him like water. Marcus lowered himself into the judge's seat, the weight of the courtroom pressing down on him in a way it never had before. The polished wood of the bench felt cool beneath his hands, a familiar anchor in a moment that had been anything but ordinary. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself. Outwardly, he was composed, unreadable, but beneath the surface, something simmered. Across the room, Lawson had made himself comfortable in the audience section, stretching one arm along the back of the bench like a man watching a show he had personally directed. His smirk was subtle, but the challenge in his eyes was not. Emma Carter stood near the judge's bench, her face tight with restrained fury. She leaned in, lowering her voice so only Marcus could hear. You can't let that slide, she whispered. This is an open and shut case of assault. There are dozens of witnesses. Marcus kept his gaze forward. And if I press charges, what happens? Emma's lips parted, but she hesitated. They'll investigate, Marcus continued, voice measured. Then they'll stall. Then they'll call it misconduct, at best, and let it fade from the news cycle. Meanwhile, Lawson walks free, and I give him exactly what he wanted. Emma crossed her arms. And what's that? Marcus glanced toward Lawson, who met his gaze with a lazy tilt of his head. To see me lose control. Emma clenched her jaw, then dropped her voice even lower. You don't have to play by his rules. No, Marcus agreed, but I have to play smart. She didn't look convinced, but there was no time to argue. The courtroom was waiting. With a small nod, Marcus turned his attention back to the case at hand. The trial proceeded, but the air in the room was thick with unspoken tension. Every so often, Marcus could feel Lawson's eyes on him. The game was far from over. When the session adjourned, Marcus retreated to his chambers, shutting the heavy wooden door behind him. The moment he was alone, his fingers found his scalp, running over the uneven remnants of his hair. He had faced threats before. He had been insulted, undermined, tested, but never like this. He took a breath, pushing the thought aside. There was work to do. His desk was as he left it, neatly organized, papers stacked in their proper places. But something was different. A single manila folder sat at the center, unmarked except for a small post-it note stuck to the front. No signature, no explanation. Marcus peeled off the note and flipped the folder open. The first page was a mugshot. A young black man, barely in his 20s. Beneath it, the name. Anthony Graves. Marcus's stomach tightened. He knew that name. Graves had died in custody 6 months ago. Officially, it had been ruled a suicide. But something about the case had never sat right with him. He flipped the page. The second photo was worse. A grainy security image from inside a detention facility. There, in the background, stood Derek Lawson. Marcus sat at his desk, staring at the grainy security image of Anthony Graves. The young man had been booked for a minor drug charge, something that should never have resulted in a death behind bars. But there it was. Official cause, suicide. And in the background of that same image, standing near a holding cell, was Derek Lawson. His grip tightened around the edge of the file. He had seen plenty of cases where the system failed people like Graves. But something about this one felt different. The missing details, the lack of any internal review. And now, this folder appearing on his desk as if someone wanted him to see it but didn't dare speak aloud. A knock on the door pulled him out of his thoughts. Emma stepped in, holding her phone, her expression grim. "I ran a check on Lawson," she said, placing the device on the desk. "He's been the subject of at least 4 complaints for excessive force in the last 5 years. Marcus wasn't surprised. "How many made it to trial?" Emma gave a dry laugh. "None. Every case either got buried in paperwork or the victims refused to cooperate." She made air quotes with her fingers. "One of them, a man named Eric Holland, filed a formal complaint 3 years ago. He was found in an alley 2 weeks later, beaten so badly he couldn't talk. No arrests were ever made." Marcus glanced at the screen. Eric Holland. The name wasn't familiar, but the pattern was. "And Anthony Graves?" Emma nodded. "He was arrested 6 months ago. Held overnight. Next morning, he was dead." The words settled between them, heavy and unspoken. Marcus leaned back, rubbing his temple. "Lawson's name is on both cases." Emma folded her arms. "So what now?" Marcus considered for a moment. "We need someone who can tell us what really happened." Emma raised a brow. "Someone inside?" He nodded. "Someone who was there." A name came to mind almost immediately. Daniel Briggs had been with the department for nearly 20 years. He was known as one of the rare officers who still believed in the badge. Not just the power that came with it. If anyone had tried to investigate Lawson before, it would have been him. Marcus picked up the phone and dialed a number from memory. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Judge Bennett, Lieutenant Briggs," Marcus said, keeping his voice even. "I need to ask you about a case." There was a pause. Then Briggs exhaled. "I was wondering when you'd call." A flicker of unease ran through Marcus. "You already know what this is about?" "I had a feeling," Briggs admitted. "But if we're talking, it's not on the phone. Meet me at the old train yard, off Lexington, in an hour." Before Marcus could respond, the line went dead. He set the phone down, exchanging a look with Emma. "Well, that's not ominous," she muttered. Marcus grabbed his coat. "Stay here. If I'm not back in 2 hours, call someone you trust." Emma frowned. "I don't like this." "Neither do I," Marcus admitted, "but I don't think I have a choice." Later that night, after meeting with Briggs, Marcus returned home exhausted. The moment he stepped inside, his phone rang. He hesitated before answering. A low, distorted voice crackled through the speaker. "Walk away, Judge Bennett, or you won't get another chance." The line went dead. Marcus stood in the dim light of his living room, the silence stretching around him. Whoever had sent that file wanted him to see the truth. Whoever made this call wanted him to forget it. The night air was thick with humidity, clinging to Marcus's skin as he drove through the quiet streets of Minneapolis. The glow of streetlights stretched across the windshield, casting long, fractured shadows inside the car. He had barely spoken since the phone call. The distorted voice still echoed in his head. "Walk away." His hands tightened around the steering wheel. He had spent his entire career upholding the law, believing in its power to protect, to serve. Now, for the first time, he felt like prey. Up ahead, a pair of red and blue lights flared to life. His stomach dropped. He eased the car to the curb, his movements careful, deliberate. Through the rearview mirror, he saw 2 figures step out of the patrol car. The first was tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the confidence of someone who had done this many times before. The second was leaner, younger, hesitant. Marcus already knew who was in charge. A sharp knock on the window confirmed it. Rolling it down, he met Derek Lawson's smirking face. "Judge Bennett," Lawson said, voice dripping with false politeness. "You're out late." Marcus kept his expression neutral. "Is there a problem, officer?" Lawson leaned down, resting one arm against the door. "Routine stop. Suspicious activity in the area. You wouldn't mind if we take a look inside, would you?" Suspicious activity. The phrase was deliberately vague, just enough to justify whatever came next. "I do mind," Marcus said calmly, "unless you have probable cause." Lawson let out a low chuckle. "Come on, Judge. No need to make this difficult." The younger officer shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't expecting resistance. Marcus met Lawson's gaze, unwavering. I know my rights. For a moment, the street felt unnaturally still. A test of wills playing out in the space between them. Then, with the fluidity of someone who had done this before, Lawson reached into his vest, pulled out a small plastic bag, and flicked it into the car. Drugs in plain sight, he announced loudly, stepping back, his voice carried across the street, just loud enough for the few onlookers at the corner to hear. Looks like we got ourselves a problem. The younger officer stiffened, his mouth opened slightly, as if he wanted to say something. Marcus didn't look away. This was a game Lawson had played before. Only this time, his target wasn't some nameless suspect. Lawson grinned. Step out of the vehicle. Judge. When Marcus didn't move, Lawson's hand went to his holster. A slow breath. Marcus pushed the door open and stepped out. His heartbeat was steady, but his hands curled into fists at his sides. From the corner of his eye, he saw people beginning to gather. A couple walking their dog had stopped. A man near the bus stop was watching. Phone in hand. Lawson noticed too. He grabbed Marcus's arm, twisting it roughly behind his back, pressing him against the hood of the car. Judge Bennett, you're under arrest for possession of a controlled substance, Lawson said, his voice carrying through the night air. A sharp click echoed as the cold metal of handcuffs locked around Marcus's wrists. He lifted his head slightly, catching his own reflection in the side mirror. A judge, in cuffs, under the glow of flashing red and blue. And Lawson, grinning like he had already won. Marcus sat on the hard metal bench, his back straight, hands resting loosely on his lap. The cell smelled of disinfectant and stale sweat, the air thick with the quiet murmurs of other detainees down the hall. He had spent his career inside courtrooms, dictating the course of justice. Now, he was just another man behind bars, waiting. Outside the holding area, officers moved with purpose, their voices a dull hum against the sterile walls. Every so often, one of them would glance toward him, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed satisfaction. The door at the end of the corridor opened with a metallic clang. A uniformed officer stepped inside, followed by Emma Carter, her expression a mixture of worry and determination. Judge Bennett, the officer announced, unlocking the cell. Your lawyer is here. Emma wasted no time stepping inside. We're working on getting you out, she said, voice low but urgent. They're trying to drag this out as long as possible. But the charges won't hold. Marcus met her gaze. How long? Emma sighed. A few more hours. Maybe. I had to call in a favor to push things along. She hesitated, then lowered her voice even further. They're playing dirty. Lawson's already spinning the story. And it's working. Marcus had expected as much. He leaned forward slightly. How bad? Emma took out her phone, glancing toward the officer before turning the screen to him. A news article was already making the rounds. Judge Marcus Bennett arrested on drug possession charges. Marcus skimmed the opening lines. The language was careful, the tone measured, but the damage was done. They haven't charged you yet, Emma continued, but they don't have to. The headline alone is enough to plant doubt. Marcus exhaled slowly. We need to fight back. Emma nodded. I already started. She slid the phone back into her pocket. I reached out to James Holloway. He's waiting to meet me now. Marcus gave a small nod. James Holloway was a veteran journalist. The kind who didn't chase sensationalism but dug for the truth. If anyone could bring light to this, it was him. Emma stood, glancing toward the officer still lingering by the door. Just hold tight, she murmured before walking out. Marcus leaned back against the cold wall, staring up at the ceiling. The system was moving against him. But it hadn't won, not yet. Hours later, as the wheels of his release were set in motion, another news alert flashed across Emma's phone. Lawson stood behind a podium, cameras flashing around him. His face was calm, authoritative. Judge Bennett is now under investigation for possible connections to an active drug ring. He declared, we take these allegations seriously and will ensure that no one, no matter their position, is above the law. Emma's stomach tightened. This wasn't just an arrest. This was a full-blown character assassination. The first thing Marcus noticed after stepping out of the station was the cold. Not the kind that came from the late-night air, but the kind that settled in his chest. It was the weight of something irreversible. The moment those cuffs had snapped around his wrists, the perception of who he was had changed. Outside, Emma was waiting by the curb, arms crossed, her expression a mixture of relief and quiet frustration. "They let you out," she said, opening the passenger door to her car. "They had no choice," Marcus replied, settling into the seat. For now. Emma pulled into traffic, her hands gripping the wheel a little too tightly. "Briggs called me," she said, "told me to get you to his place. Said it was urgent." Marcus turned toward her. "He found something." Emma nodded, her jaw tightening. "And you're going to want to see it." They drove in silence, winding through the quieter streets of Minneapolis until they reached an apartment complex tucked away in a less traveled part of the city. Briggs was already waiting outside, his stance tense, eyes scanning the street before motioning them inside. The moment the door closed, Briggs pulled out a laptop, placed it on the small kitchen table, and hit play. The footage was grainy, taken from a camera inside the police station's holding area. Marcus leaned in, watching as the scene unfolded. There he was, sitting on the bench, calm, waiting. The door opened. Lawson entered, speaking to the younger officer from the arrest. There was no audio, but the interaction was clear. Lawson reached into his vest, pulled out the small bag of powder, and palmed it before turning toward the camera's blind spot. A few seconds later, he stepped back into view, now holding the bag up as if he had just discovered it. The younger officer's posture stiffened, his hands twitching slightly at his sides. Then he turned away. Briggs paused the video. "That kid knew," he said quietly. "He knew it was planted." Marcus exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Why hasn't this been exposed?" Briggs leaned back. "Because they buried it. This footage wasn't supposed to exist. The system automatically deletes non-incident recordings after 48 hours. Someone must have flagged it and kept it off the books." Emma's eyes narrowed. "Someone on the inside?" Briggs nodded. "Probably, but I don't know who." Marcus sat back, fingers tapping lightly against the table. "We need to get this out." Emma hesitated. "Even if we do, Lawson's already poisoned the narrative. The public doesn't know what to believe anymore." Briggs folded his arms. "Then we need more than just a video. We need someone who was there. Someone willing to talk." Silence filled the room. Then Briggs exhaled and reached into his jacket. He pulled out a slip of paper and slid it across the table. Marcus picked it up. A name was scribbled across the surface. One he didn't recognize. "He used to be one of us," Briggs said. "Until he wasn't." Emma leaned over, reading the name aloud. "Raymond Carter." Marcus set the paper down, his pulse steady but rising. Whoever this man was, he held the key to taking Lawson down. The decision wasn't made in anger. It wasn't about pride or personal vengeance. Marcus had spent the better part of his life believing in the law, in the system's ability to correct itself if given the right push. But after everything, after the planted drugs, the arrest, the smear campaign, he knew this was bigger than him. Lawson wasn't just another corrupt officer. He was a symptom of something deeper, something rotting at the core of law enforcement in this city. And Marcus had no intention of letting it stand. So he made the call. Emma sat across from him at the kitchen table, her laptop open, fingers poised over the keyboard. "Are you sure about this?" Marcus nodded. "I'm filing a civil rights lawsuit against the department." Emma let out a slow breath. "That means depositions, public scrutiny, every part of your life picked apart." "I know. And if this goes to trial? Then we make sure the truth gets out," Marcus said simply. Emma studied him for a moment, then turned to her screen. "All right, let's build the case." For the next few hours, they worked in silence, piecing together everything. Lawson's history of excessive force, the buried complaints, the video Briggs had recovered. The evidence was damning, but Marcus knew evidence wasn't always enough. He needed people willing to stand beside him. As if reading his mind, Emma glanced up. "We need Raymond Carter." Marcus tapped his pen against the table. The name Briggs had given them lingered in the back of his mind. A former cop, once part of the system, now living in its shadow. If Carter had walked away from the force, there had to be a reason. "I'll find him," Marcus said. Emma hesitated. "And what if he doesn't want to be found?" Marcus met her gaze. "Then we give him a reason." That night, after Emma left, Marcus poured himself a glass of water and leaned against the counter. His mind was still turning, running through every possible outcome, every risk. Then the doorbell rang. A package sat on his doorstep, unmarked except for his name scrawled in black ink. He carried it inside, placed it on the table, and carefully peeled back the seal. Inside were photographs. His wife, his daughter, candid shots, at the grocery store, walking to school, sitting in their car, and beneath them, a single line written in red marker. If you keep pushing, they're next. Marcus inhaled deeply, forcing his hands to remain steady. This was the system striking back, but it had just made its biggest mistake. Marcus stood outside the courthouse, a folder tucked under his arm, the weight of it far heavier than the paper inside. The evidence was solid. The surveillance footage alone should have been enough to raise alarms, to force an investigation. Yet, as he stepped inside and made his way toward the clerk's office, he knew better than to expect a simple resolution. The clerk barely glanced up as he slid the folder across the counter. "Filing?" she asked. Marcus nodded. "Video evidence directly contradicts the official report filed by Officer Derek Lawson." The woman flipped through the paperwork, her expression neutral, then typed something into her computer. Seconds stretched as she scanned the screen. Then, with a practiced detachment, she slid the folder back toward him. "The district attorney's office has reviewed this footage," she said, her tone flat. "They've determined that while it raises concerns, it does not meet the threshold for formal charges at this time." Marcus exhaled slowly. "You're telling me that video evidence of a police officer planting drugs isn't enough?" She didn't look up. "That's what the decision states." He stared at her for a beat, then picked up the folder and turned away. He wasn't surprised, but that didn't mean the disappointment didn't sting. The system was moving exactly as it was designed to, protecting its own. By the time Marcus stepped outside, the media had already caught wind of the situation. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust in his direction. "Judge Bennett, do you believe the case against Officer Lawson is being deliberately buried? Is this retaliation for your rulings in past misconduct cases? Do you intend to pursue further action?" Marcus kept walking, his expression unreadable. He knew how this worked. Some reporters were there for the truth, but others were looking for a headline, a soundbite that could be twisted in tomorrow's paper. That evening, Marcus sat across from James Holloway and Daniel Briggs in a small, dimly lit newsroom office. A single recording device sat between them. "You're sure about this?" Holloway asked. "Once we put this out there, there's no taking it back." Marcus nodded. "They want this buried. That means it's worth exposing." Holloway pressed record. "All right, Judge Bennett, let's talk about Derek Lawson." For the next hour, Marcus and Briggs laid it all out. Lawson's history, the complaints that had gone nowhere, the patterns of abuse. The interview would air in the morning. A piece of the puzzle Marcus hoped would force a real investigation. But the system wasn't going to sit back and let him win. Across town, Emma Carter was leaving a small law office, her hands clutching a file of additional reports that might strengthen their case. She stepped onto the sidewalk, glancing around, a nagging feeling creeping up her spine. The street was quieter than it should have been for this hour. She shook it off and started walking toward her car. The roar of an engine came first, then headlights. The black sedan was moving too fast, veering toward her. Emma barely had time to react before she threw herself to the side, hitting the pavement as the car sped past, tires screeching. She lay there, her pulse pounding. Whoever was behind the wheel wasn't trying to scare her. They had meant to kill her. The morning headlines were louder than usual. News stations ran segments dissecting Marcus's interview with James Holloway, some calling it a bold stand against corruption, others painting it as a desperate attempt to salvage his reputation. Online, the debate raged. Was he a hero or a man trying to distract from his own scandal? The division was exactly what Lawson and his backers needed. When the truth became subjective, it lost its power. That same morning, the Minneapolis Police Department held a press conference. The chief stood at the podium, reading from a carefully worded statement. "In light of recent allegations, we are launching an internal review into Officer Derek Lawson's conduct. We take all claims of misconduct seriously and will conduct a thorough investigation." Marcus watched the broadcast from his office. jaw tightening. There was one thing missing from that statement: suspension. Lawson would remain on duty. The so-called investigation was nothing more than a formality, a delay tactic designed to quiet public pressure. Emma paced the room, arms crossed. They're giving him cover. Marcus exhaled. Of course they are. She shook her head, frustration clear in her voice. Even after that video? Marcus leaned forward, pressing his fingers together. The footage proves the drugs were planted. But what it doesn't do is prove intent. They'll argue it's inconclusive, that the officer in the video simply found the drugs and made a procedural mistake. Emma scoffed. A mistake that just happened to put a sitting judge behind bars? Marcus gave her a wry look. The system doesn't care about logic. It cares about optics. She stopped pacing. Then we need to go higher. An hour later, Marcus sat across from Judge Henry Calloway, one of the most respected judges in the state. Calloway had been a mentor, a man Marcus had once believed shared his commitment to justice. But today, there was something unreadable in the older man's expression. I understand your frustration, Calloway said, folding his hands. But there's a process for these things. Marcus kept his voice even. The process is broken. Calloway sighed. Launching a formal inquiry into a police officer isn't as simple as filing a motion. It requires undeniable proof of misconduct. And frankly, with all the controversy surrounding your arrest, Marcus sat forward. That controversy was engineered. You know that. Calloway didn't deny it. Instead, he leaned back, studying Marcus carefully. I'm advising you to let this play out. Marcus's fingers curled into fists. And what happens when it plays out the way they want? When they drag this out long enough for the public to move on, for the news cycle to shift, and suddenly, Lawson walks away clean? Calloway exhaled, rubbing his temple. You're making enemies you can't afford. Marcus stood, his chair scraping against the floor. I don't care about enemies. I care about justice. Calloway's eyes flickered with something. Pity. Perhaps. Or maybe it was warning. Be careful what you chase, he said quietly. Marcus didn't reply. He turned and walked out, his heart pounding with frustration. That night, his phone rang. It was Briggs. They wiped it, Briggs said without preamble. His voice was tense, clipped. Marcus frowned. What? The internal files on Lawson. Complaints, reports, disciplinary actions. All gone. Marcus stopped in his tracks. How is that even possible? Briggs let out a hollow laugh. Possible? No. Deliberate? Absolutely. Someone high up is covering for him. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, forcing himself to think. The system wasn't just protecting Lawson. It was protecting something bigger. And now, they weren't just fighting one corrupt cop. They were fighting an entire machine. Marcus sat at his desk, staring at his laptop screen. The email had come through just after midnight. Its subject line simple but chilling. They're all connected. His cursor hovered over the message for a moment before he clicked. The body of the email contained no text, just an attachment, a single file labeled names.pdf. He hesitated for only a second before opening it. A list appeared, a neatly formatted table of names, ranks, and positions within the Minneapolis Police Department. Some he recognized immediately, officers who had been on the force for years. A few whose names had surfaced in misconduct complaints that never went anywhere. Others were unfamiliar. And then his eyes stopped on a name that shouldn't have been there. Judge Daniel McCarthy. Marcus sat back, his mind racing. McCarthy was no ordinary judge. He was one of the most powerful figures in the state's judicial system. A man whose reputation for being tough on crime had made him a favorite in law enforcement circles. He had been a mentor to many in the legal community, Marcus included, until now. Emma's voice pulled him out of his thoughts. You're not going to like this, she said, stepping into the room, her phone in hand. Marcus rubbed his temple. You first. Emma sat across from him, scrolling through something on her screen. I looked deeper into Lawson's disciplinary history, or what's left of it. The cases against him didn't just disappear. They were dismissed by a superior court ruling. Guess which judge signed off on those dismissals? Marcus already knew the answer. McCarthy. Emma set her phone down. If he's protecting Lawson, who else is he covering for? Marcus exhaled, fingers drumming against the desk. We need more than names. We need a link. Emma nodded. Then we find out what McCarthy is hiding. Before Marcus could respond, his phone buzzed. An unknown number. He answered cautiously. The line crackled for a second, then went silent. Hello? Marcus said. No response. Then, faintly, a voice he barely recognized. Help me. Marcus stiffened. Who is this? A ragged breath. Emma. His pulse kicked up. Emma? He turned toward her, still sitting across from him, eyes widening in confusion. The call wasn't coming from her phone. Marcus's stomach dropped. The voice on the line trembled. They have me. The line went dead. Emma's phone buzzed at the same moment. A single text message. Walk away, Judge Bennett, or she won't come back. The air in Marcus's office felt heavier than usual, like the walls had drawn closer, trapping him inside. His phone sat on the desk, the screen still glowing from the text message. Walk away, or she won't come back. Emma was gone. His mind raced through the possibilities. Whoever had taken her wasn't interested in money or revenge. They wanted control. They wanted to break him. The phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a text. It was a video. With a deep breath, he tapped the screen. The image was grainy, the lighting dim. Emma sat in a chair, hands bound, her face turned away from the camera. She wasn't struggling, but Marcus could see the tension in her shoulders. Then a voice, deep and unmistakable. Lawson, you've been a real pain. Judge. His tone was casual, almost amused. You think you're fighting for justice, but all you're doing is making enemies. He stepped into the frame, his face partially obscured by the shadows. He crouched next to Emma, tilting his head. So here's the deal, Lawson continued. You drop the lawsuit. You stop talking to Holloway. You stop digging into McCarthy. And she goes home, safe and sound. Emma lifted her head slightly, her eyes flashing toward the camera. There was no fear there, only defiance. Lawson smirked. Or, you keep pushing. And she doesn't. The video ended. Marcus stared at the screen, his pulse steady despite the storm raging inside him. This wasn't just about Emma. It wasn't even about him. It was about proving a point. That the system could not be challenged. That those in power would always find a way to crush those who stood against them. Briggs burst into the office, his expression tight. We got a location. Marcus looked up sharply. Where? Briggs hesitated. Not exact, but we traced the video metadata. Industrial district, somewhere near the river. Marcus grabbed his coat. Briggs blocked the door. Think for a second, he said. You go charging in. You won't just lose Emma. You'll lose everything. Marcus met his gaze. If I don't go, I've already lost. Briggs exhaled, his jaw tightening. Then we do this smart. Marcus knew what he was asking. Walk away, save Emma, or keep fighting and risk losing her forever. There was no easy answer. But there never was. Marcus stood by the window of his office, staring at the city lights stretching beyond the courthouse. His phone vibrated on the desk. Another message. Clocks ticking. Here's where to find her. Attached was a set of GPS coordinates. Briggs leaned over, his jaw tight as he read the screen. Industrial district. Right where we thought. Marcus exhaled. It's a trap. Briggs nodded. Of course it's a trap. They had both seen Lawson operate long enough to know how he played his games. This wasn't just about leverage anymore. This was about power. About proving that the system always won. Marcus straightened. We need backup. Briggs shook his head. We can't trust half the department. If we call it in, Lawson gets tipped off before we even get there. Marcus already knew that, but going in blind wasn't an option either. Briggs seemed to read his thoughts. I can call in a favor. A couple of guys I trust. Marcus hesitated. Can they get there quietly? Briggs's expression hardened. If they can't, they won't come at all. Marcus nodded once. Then let's move. The drive to the industrial district was silent, the tension thick in the car. Marcus kept his eyes on the road, his grip firm on the wheel. The streets grew emptier as they left downtown, the glow of city lights fading into the distance. When they reached the coordinates, an old warehouse loomed ahead, its structure skeletal against the night sky. The building had been abandoned for years, but tonight, a single floodlight burned over the entrance. Marcus pulled the car to a stop a block away. Briggs checked his weapon. We go in slow. We don't let them separate us. Marcus didn't answer. He was already moving. Inside, the air was thick with dust and rust. The faint scent of oil lingering. The sound of their footsteps echoed against the concrete as they moved further in. Then Marcus saw her. Emma sat in the center of the room, tied to a metal chair. Her head tilted downward. Her breathing was steady, but her wrists were bound tightly behind her back. And beside her, Derek Lawson stood waiting. He was calm, as if he had been expecting them for hours. In his hand, a gun rested at his side. His grip loose, relaxed. You actually came, Lawson mused, shaking his head. You know, I thought you were smarter than this. Marcus took a slow step forward. His voice even. Let her go. Lawson chuckled. And here I was hoping you'd be more original. He gestured to the empty space around them. No cameras, no witnesses, no courtroom to hide behind this time. Judge. Marcus held his ground. You don't want to do this. Lawson smirked. You still think this is about what I want? He lifted the gun, pointing it at Marcus's chest. This is about teaching you a lesson. Briggs shifted beside Marcus, his hand hovering near his holster. You shoot him. You lose whatever power you think you have left. Lawson tilted his head. Do I? His finger tightened on the trigger. The shot rang out. Marcus barely flinched as the bullet struck the wall behind him, sending dust and debris into the air. Lawson grinned. Relax, Judge. I'm not done playing yet. The shot was still ringing in Marcus's ears, the dust from the bullet's impact settling in the cold air of the warehouse. Lawson grinned, tilting his head as if gauging Marcus's reaction, waiting to see fear. But Marcus didn't move. He kept his eyes locked on Lawson, the weight of the moment pressing down on them both. You don't scare me, Marcus said, his voice low and steady. Lawson smirked. Then you're not paying attention. He took a step forward, gun still raised, but his stance had relaxed just slightly, enough for Marcus to seize the moment. With practiced control, Marcus shifted his weight and lunged forward, closing the distance between them in a single breath. He grabbed Lawson's wrist, forcing the gun downward. The weapon discharged, the shot striking the concrete floor with a sharp crack. Lawson twisted violently, but Marcus held firm. They struggled, each fighting for control. Marcus could feel the raw strength in the officer's grip, the years of training behind every movement. But Marcus had something Lawson didn't: purpose. Then, from the shadows, a voice rang out. Drop it, hands where I can see them. Lawson stiffened. Marcus turned just enough to see Briggs standing behind them, his gun trained on Lawson's head. Now, Briggs ordered. For a brief second, the entire warehouse held its breath. Then another figure stepped from the shadows. A second officer, his badge glinting under the dim light, moving fast. Before Briggs could react, the officer grabbed him from behind, twisting his arm and forcing the gun from his grip. Briggs let out a grunt of pain as the weapon clattered to the ground. Lawson grinned. You really think I'd come alone? The officer behind Briggs tightened his hold, keeping him locked in place. Marcus's heart pounded. The advantage was gone. Lawson had played them, lured them into a fight they couldn't win. Lawson stepped back, straightening his jacket. He picked up his gun from the floor and aimed it directly at Marcus's chest. This, he said, shaking his head, is why you don't go against the system. Marcus forced himself to stay calm. There was still a way out. He just had to find it. Then, a sound, a faint scraping, barely noticeable over the tension. Lawson didn't hear it. His attention was locked on Marcus. But Marcus did, and he knew exactly what it was. In one swift motion, Emma moved, her hands, now free, shot forward, yanking Lawson backward with everything she had. He stumbled, his aim shifting. Marcus didn't hesitate. He drove his shoulder into Lawson, sending them both crashing to the ground. The gun flew from Lawson's grip, sliding across the floor. Briggs, seeing the opening, elbowed his captor hard in the ribs. Breaking free, Lawson rolled, reaching for his weapon. But Marcus got there first. He grabbed the gun and aimed it directly at Lawson. The warehouse fell silent. Lawson froze, breathing heavily, his eyes darting between Marcus and the gun in his hand. For the first time since this all began, Marcus saw something in Lawson's face that hadn't been there before. Doubt. Lawson knelt on the ground, His hands locked behind his head, the sharp metallic click of Briggs's cuffs sealing his fate. The arrogance in his expression hadn't faded. If anything, the moment seemed to amuse him. "You think this changes anything?" Lawson scoffed, glancing up at Marcus. "You think taking me down means you win?" Marcus held his stare, his breath steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through him. Lawson's smirk widened. "I'm not the only one. Bennett, I'm just a soldier. You haven't even met the generals yet." Briggs tightened the cuffs, forcing him forward. "Yeah? Well, you're the first domino." Emma, still catching her breath, stood beside Marcus. The marks on her wrists from the restraints were raw, but her eyes were sharp. "We'll make sure the rest fall, too." Lawson laughed under his breath. "Then you better start running. Because they're already cleaning house." Outside, sirens wailed, red and blue lights flashing against the rusted metal of the warehouse. Briggs's backup had arrived. Officers he trusted. Men and women not on Lawson's payroll. They moved quickly, securing the scene, ensuring that this time, there would be no cover-up. But Marcus knew this wasn't over. As Lawson was shoved into the back of a squad car, Marcus turned to Briggs. "We need to go after McCarthy." Briggs nodded grimly. "I already made a call. The feds are getting involved." Marcus glanced at Emma, who was rubbing her wrists absently. She met his gaze, determination flickering behind her exhaustion. "They won't be able to bury this anymore," she said. "Not with everything we have." The city skyline loomed in the distance, the weight of what they had uncovered settling over them. The network Lawson was a part of wasn't just about one corrupt cop. It was deeper, entrenched in the system itself. Judges, officers, politicians, people who had spent years building a fortress of untouchability. And now, for the first time, that fortress was cracking. The next morning, the headlines told the story the system had tried to keep buried. City-wide corruption probe launched, high-ranking officials under investigation. Judge McCarthy implicated in cover-up of police misconduct. Former officer Derek Lawson arrested amidst federal investigation. Marcus sat in his office, the paper resting in front of him. This wasn't the end, but it was a beginning. The courtroom was silent as the judge delivered the sentence. Derek Lawson sat at the defense table, his hands clasped, his face unreadable. The arrogance, the smirks, the quiet threats, none of it remained. The weight of the evidence, the testimonies, the years of abuse finally crashing down, had left him with only one reality. 20 years, no parole. A murmur spread through the room. Emma exhaled sharply beside Marcus, tension unwinding from her shoulders. Briggs nodded, barely a flicker of satisfaction in his expression. Justice, at least for now, had been served. But Marcus felt no relief. Because Lawson had been right about one thing. He wasn't the only one. Outside the courthouse, the press swarmed, cameras flashing, microphones pushing forward. The city wanted a statement, a final word to close the chapter. Marcus stepped forward, scanning the faces around him, searching for something. Certainty, resolution. But deep down, he already knew the truth. This wasn't the end. That night, as he sat in his office, a single envelope lay on his desk. No return address, no markings. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "You won this battle, but the war isn't over." Marcus ran his fingers over the words, then looked toward the window. The city stretching beyond. Somewhere out there, someone else was watching, waiting, continuing the cycle. And Marcus knew, he couldn't stop now. Justice wasn't a moment. It was a fight that never truly ended. Justice isn't just about winning a case. It's about standing up when the system tries to break you. Marcus Bennett fought not just for himself, but for everyone who had been silenced, proving that even in a world stacked against you, the truth still matters. But this story raises a bigger question. If one corrupt officer was just the beginning, how deep does the system's rot really go? What do you think? Is true justice even possible? Or is it just a battle we have to keep fighting? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories that expose the truth, subscribe to Covert Truths, because some stories deserve to be told.